as you know, I'm a storyteller. I literally sit in front of an audience or sit in the middle of a wood with a load of people sitting on stinging nettles and tell stories. And I'm very aware that storytelling as a term or as an idea now is used to encompass a huge range of very different forms. I'm trying to avoid saying ways of telling stories. But storytelling now is a huge ecosystem of different interactions and different ways of engaging people. And what I thought would be interesting to do was for all of us to talk about what we think of as ways of telling a story, why we use stories rather than any other medium, and what we hope that might do for our audiences, however those audiences engage with that story. Does that make sense? If not, just improvise. We're storytellers. You make it up as you go along. So, as I said, you know me, I'm Gordon. So I'm gonna hand over to Eloise. Would you like to kick off?
Thank you. Yeah, hi. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I guess it might be useful because I think a lot of people in here are filmmakers. So I'm going to give a quick background as to where I come from and why I'm here. So I started off working at a studio called Pinewood Studios, and I worked on a bunch of different productions from Murder on the Orient Express to Ready Player One to Bake Off and everything sort of in between. And then I went freelance, and then I worked at Lionsgate, and then 8 years ago I set up my own company, and I made a bunch of short films, and then a feature film which actually was a co-production with Ranyard that premiered here. That went to Amazon, and then I made a film with Billy Piper called Rare Beasts, and another film with Pierce Brosnan called The Last Rifleman. And about 5 years ago, actually a bit longer now, about 7 years ago, I started developing a story called The Pirate Queen, which initially we were going to make as a film, and we can kind of go into the storytelling aspect of that and why we chose that story, but we couldn't get it off the ground because of the pandemic and all of the sort of difficulties that came with it, so we pivoted and turned it into a VR experience, and that's how I know Dave. And now as a result, that got released, and we premiered at Tribeca and then got nominated for an Emmy, and now we're turning it into a TV show. So it's a really interesting way to tell a story and to look at how stories can be told and kind of pivot and think outside the box and how you want to tell your stories. I think in terms of what and why I tell stories, I've worked on films and I've developed films that I am really proud of and films that my heart is not in it. And so as a result now, I always ask like one question any time that I consider making a project. And it's basically a line, and I have to answer it. And I fundamentally believe this story should be told because. And I think if you can answer that question, then you can convince anyone in the room to basically like fund it in however capacity you want that. But if you believe that it should be told, then you can express why. And I think the reason of telling a story is so personal. Like my reason for telling a story is completely different to yours. And it doesn't mean that anyone is wrong or right. It's such a personal experience, and like it's how you resonate with the characters and the narrative and what you want to create. So I think when it comes to storytelling, always asking yourself that question before you go into a room to try and like pitch an idea or talk about an idea is really important. I'm going to pass to Dave.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eloise. So you might have gathered from that we've worked together for a while. My backstory goes back a bit further. So I was a programmer at one point, and I started making video games in the 90s, and so I've been in the interactive world for a very long time, and so the thing I'm really interested in with stories is I love films and TV and sit back and enjoy a story, but I also really love being in a story and having some agency and some control over that. And so in my experience way back when, at the beginning of this millennia, I was working on a game called The Getaway, which was a sort of gritty London gangster story set just outside here. I mean, the artists at the time literally walked the streets of London, and we recreated London, which was a big deal then. And you could drive around London without stopping and loading anything, which was a big deal with the small amount of memory and CD drive we had. There was a spin-off of that called Gangs of London, which was on the PSP, the PlayStation Portable, and 18 years later it became a TV show, which is now quite a decent TV show. It's sort of interesting to see this transmedia thing is actually finally happening, because for most of the time I've been in games, it's been talked about and not necessarily happening, and I'm very interested in that as well. And one of the things, a sort of a story I've told quite often, partly because I was on the BAFTA Games Committee, and their remit is, film, TV and games. And so the story goes like this, and it's not as creative, this is more like just anecdotal. There's TV and film are amazing, everybody loves it, and actually the last 10 or 15 years TV's really had some probably more interesting storylines than film. That feels like the baton has handed over a bit. And games for a long, long time were like this awkward second cousin that nobody really wanted to bring out at the wedding or the family party or whatever. And then games made loads of money, and in games we thought, we've arrived, we're here. But we then felt like we were the Beverly Hillbillies, all money and no class. And we weren't really on a creative level playing field. But I think the last 5 years, and projects like The Pirate Queen, which is, made the very cool VR narrative and is now being a, very cool TV show. It sort of shows that we've levelled that playing field, and things like The Last of Us, which was a game for a long time, is coming now, a really good TV show, Fallout, and a bunch of others. And suddenly that world, actually this sort of transmedia world, is blurred. And so now what I'm really interested in looking at and asking the question around is, how do you tell those stories in these different mediums? What's the difference between a film and a TV show? I don't know. I've been watching Andor, which is one of the Star Wars spin-offs, and it's like, okay, so this is what Star Wars, if it was a film, is now like as a TV show. It's quite a bit slower. It's got quite a few similar plot points, but just like in episode 3, rather than 30 minutes in or whatever. So it's sort of interesting to see how that works. But then, for me, really, the thing of, well, what's it like to tell that as an interactive story? And then when you get into XR, VR in particular, what's it like if you can actually be a character doing real things in this story? And that's the bit that I get really excited about. Anyway, I'm now going to pass over.
Thanks. Great to be with everyone today. So I sort of got into storytelling through YouTube when I was 15 years ago, when I was 12, making very important videos such as Pokemon versus Digimon, which is the better one, quite a controversial topic. And that sort of accidentally, over the years of starting, just talking to a webcam, I sort of accidentally learned about things like editing. And the more years went on and the more I grew up, the more I wanted to introduce sort of fictional elements. And it was sort of like I didn't, looking back, it's quite an interesting time because I didn't really realise I was teaching myself about how to make stuff just through sort of trial and error. Or like, even if it was just like, I said something embarrassing about Pokemon there, let's delete that. It's like, something interesting's happened by deleting it. And then over the years, past maybe 4 or 5 years, I've sort of transitioned more into making short films. So it's sort of been quite a natural growth of sort of like talking about sort of like my own personal life, using my camera, my little handy cam to sort of film my family and stuff, and sort of using stories as a way to sort of understand little chapters of my life, like little personal video journals, really. So to go back to sort of that original question, I think stories for me are a way to sort of understand my life, and I always come to similar to sort of what Eloise was saying, whenever I'm thinking about an idea for a video or a film, I'm always thinking like, what part of my life can this help me understand? So it's always been a very personal thing, and it always comes from that sort of initial place of thinking about sort of my own life, really, and it goes from there.
I mean, what really resonated with me there was Eloise talking about integrity and passion, and that needing to believe in a story. Well, for me as a teller, I have to believe in a story to be able to tell it effectively, to actually take an audience and bring them into it, which then ties in particularly with sort of the gaming world of really experiencing it. And in my world, that's all words. It's words, using words to create the images that give people those experiences. And when we've got the technologies we work with now, you do step into those stories, you become part of them. And it would be really interesting to talk to the children I work with about what difference that makes. You know, do they experience the difference between listening to a story, and that's a conversation, and it's a conversation that often gets missed because one side of the conversation is often silent, but they know it and they feel it, and it's personal and intimate, and it'd be really nice to know what their emotional response to those sort of experiences are or is. But I'm coming back to you again, just saying that bit about passion, and that's how you sell it, is that knowing that you believe in the story you're going to tell. And I find that I can only tell a story if I really believe in it, that it works, and otherwise it feels really stilted and awkward.
No, like, I very much agree. I think there are so many, I've done so many workshops or courses or, like, gone to lectures on pitching and, like, how to make the perfect pitch or, like, how to deliver the perfect pitch. And the reality is that there isn't a perfect pitch. Like, you can have a formula or a template or, like, deliver your logline in a certain way or whatever it is, but the way that you convince someone to, like, believe in your story is passion. It literally is, and it's so infectious, and it is the only thing. Like, I also find that we've been very lucky that I've done projects with, like, Universal and Meta, and we're doing a show with the streamer at the moment, and the person that you pitch to is going to then be your champion internally. And so they need to have the passion that you have to then take it internally and convince everyone else to say yes to the idea. And so if you can relay that passion, and it does come from this idea of just saying, I fundamentally believe this story should be told because, then you're 90% of the way there. And the rest of it is just a conversation, and it's actually just deciding, like, do you want to work with this person as much as do they want to work with you? And so I think there's a sort of shift internally on how we present our stories as well, of, like, why are we telling it, but why are you telling it? Like, why are you telling it, and why are you telling it now? And also, I think, like, I've worked on some shoots that have been really hard, like, really unbelievably challenging. And it gets to that point where, like, your van is just being broken into and the camera is, like, destroyed, and you're going to have to claim on the insurance, and someone's, like, you know, run off with your footage, and all of that stuff, like, happens. Trust me. And you're just there and you're like, why am I doing, like, genuinely, why am I doing this? And when you're at that point, it then goes back to this idea of, like, no, I believe that this story needs to be told. Like, there's a reason. And when you get to that point, you always have something to just fall back on, to be like, no, I have to tell this. Like, this story has to be told, because you're always going to have those moments. Like, everyone has those moments of just hitting absolute rock bottom and being like, I actually just can't do this. And I think building that into when you're crafting your narratives is always, like, a really strong thing to do.
I was going to pick up a little bit on what you said earlier about, you know, what kids might say about X, Y, and Z, and actually something that one of the previous speakers talked about, which was the attention deficit of the moment, and really just an experience I've had in the last 24 hours. So I'm very late to the party, but I've just bought Red Dead Redemption 2 because I want to be a cowboy, and on the one hand, we've literally got this attention economy of, like, 6 seconds is a long time. And I'm just reading up on Red Dead Redemption, people talking about, I've sunk 120 hours into this game. Nobody's going to watch a film for that long. That's probably the entirety of all the Star Trek universe, right?
Yeah.
But people will do it in video game, and because it's a slightly different way of telling stories, and also you can create some of your own stories within boundaries. So then the job of the director is not to say, well, there is generally, this is a story I want to tell, and here's some other stories as well, and you can manipulate the story to your own, to an extent as well, and play in perhaps a slightly different style and things like that. And, I think that's something that's quite interesting, and it's a weird dichotomy, isn't it? That you've got this super short attention span, but then this other thing, which actually is a crazy amount of time. And people sink so many hours into games now. It does have some challenges as well, because it means that there's maybe 5 or 10 major games that are owning 80% of the attention of the masses, and I'm sure that's causing issues other things that we could probably have a whole other debate on, which I won't go into now. But, you know, part of that as well is like telling a story, but also building systems that help people experiment with that story. Mm-hmm. So one of the games, well, we're making 2 card games at the moment, and one of them is set in the French Revolution in prison, and you play cards to avoid the guillotine. But it's a system, but then through that system we're able to tell stories and bring up little stories from history and so on, and breadcrumb things. So it's also, I think it's very interesting to this sort of slightly less linear approach to storytelling, which can draw people in a different way.
Yeah, I was just going to touch a little bit what I was saying about sort of having belief and passion about a project. I think obviously it's so important to believe in an idea, but also I think it's okay also to completely have no idea where this thing is going to go. Like I feel like at the start of the project you can feel like I've got all this passion and this belief for something, but then also there's this doubt of how am I going to do this that can sometimes sidetrack you. So I think almost right at the start and throughout, if you also have a load of doubt and you don't know how you're going to do it, that's also a really good sign just as much as belief. Like just as an example, a few years ago I made like a feature-length sort of personal documentary about sort of my family and Parkinson's disease, and I was filming for over 2 years just with my handycam, going back home, interviewing my parents and stuff. And at the end of this 2 years I was very overwhelmed with all this footage, and I sort of just started editing it, no idea where it was going to go, and it was very much like a leap of faith. And even though there was this belief of like I had this kernel of an idea that I wanted to use my camera to talk to my parents and stuff about Parkinson's, it was very much this like, I don't know if I should be talking about this. It was a very personal thing. Like it felt quite wrong. And at the end of the project, when I did have something that I was quite proud of, I don't know, it reminded me that in the next project, if I do have this feeling of like, oh, am I doing something wrong here in a weird way? I don't know what the word is for that, but there was something that was like, I think it was a reminder that it was something I was clearly passionate about, because there was some part of me that was like, oh, maybe this is too much, which I think maybe was not giving in to that doubt, but still carrying on was sort of proof that it's good to have belief, but also use doubt as a way to show you're doing something you care about. Is that, if that's a sentence? Or...
Well, I think actually it's we're back to integrity. Actually, you're doing it's a very honest story, and it's an honest process. And no, you don't know where it's going to go. And I always think that's fine. It's much more interesting to have a story that, yeah, you're not in control. The story has picked up its own life and is wandering off, and it might be a very human, sort of real family story. It might be something completely strange and mad, but it's that almost trust the creative process that will let a story unfold and gather its own momentum and be honest to its subject matter. And I've just seen Aidan, and I suspect we're running out of time. I've lost Mac.
About 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So that means I then lose my thread. So what was I going to say? I was coming back to games and VR, and it's about immersal, isn't it? It's about that sucking people completely into another world. I mean, and a good film does that. A good film absorbs you, and a good told story does that. What I really like telling stories to big groups of people, and at the end of it, someone will come up and say, "You know that story you told me?" And it's theirs. They are completely, the other 199 people don't count. It was an exchange between me as the teller and that single person. And for me, that's really special. That sense of you've reached out and you've touched somebody. And I get that because all my stuff is face to face. So do you get that similar echoes back from audiences? Do you get a reinvigoration from the people you work with, or the films you offer, or the stories you offer?
So I've got this story to tell quite a lot about what it's like particularly doing virtual reality, which is if you're watching a movie, and I use the example of Harold Lloyd, the old silent comedian, you have to fall in love with the main character to care what happens to them. And there's a famous picture of Harold Lloyd hanging off this clock, and you think he's going to fall to his death. And I'd say probably, and this is a real guess, 60% of movies have got some gravity-related, like scary bits based on one of the main characters, right? And we've all watched a movie where we don't care about the main character, and therefore we sort of don't really care, if they fall off the cliff, bridge, whatever it is. But if you go into virtual reality, you don't have to fall in love with the main character because you are the main character. And so it's a really interesting additional tool in the creative toolbox that you can short circuit certain things. You don't have to spend 10 minutes falling in love with a character. When we first experimented with it, we did some really simple things. This is when I was working at PlayStation, where we did some stuff where, there's a character, you go in and there's a character and he's pointing a gun at you. And it's very different to watching two characters with one pointing a gun at another one on TV. Because when there's a gun being pointed at you, you feel more scared. And we actually got the head of the studios to kneel down and have this character point at you, which was, it was very entertaining to watch. But it really made the point that this very first person experience is quite different to watching it play out on a screen. That's my little story about that.
The point being that VR can create empathy, and immersive experiences can create empathy in a way that traditional 2D storytelling doesn't. And to answer your question, we've shown, we just released a project that premiered at Cannes called Trailblazer, that's voiced by Daisy Ridley, and so we show projects at festivals a lot, and you can literally see when someone takes off a headset and they're like, oh my god, that was amazing, that was so cool. This experience is about a woman who basically steals her husband's invention and goes on the world's first road trip, and it's a true story about Bertha Benz, which then becomes the origin story of Mercedes-Benz. And you can see people when they take off a headset and they're like, oh my god, this is amazing, this is such an extraordinary thing, I got to drive the world's first car. And that's an experience that you can't do in real life. I can't just walk into a garage and say, can I just drive the world's first car, please? It doesn't exist. And I think that's what's so special about immersive storytelling, is that you can take people on a journey that you really can't in any other way. And so it is a very different way of telling stories.
I think what's important is that we can still have the same high level concept of a story. I think the thing that we both worked on is how do you take that kernel of a story and then what is it in virtual reality versus a TV show versus a film versus you're doing other medium, stories, books and so on. And that actually is where this thing of going across those different things is finally happening. And I think it hasn't been when I used to early days of making video games, if it was a licensed game it was always terrible because they paid so much for the license they had no money to make the game. But now there's much better licensed games, for example. I know that's a bit businessy, but you get the idea.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say about the original question about how an audience can take on a story. Yeah, I feel like it's good from a YouTube background. I've been very fortunate to have people who interact with a lot of quite personal films that I put out there, and it's always that quote of the more personal it is, the more universal. I've really saw that firsthand with you can talk about your family and suddenly you can see comments from people that's a paragraph long talking about their family, and I know stuff like that when sort of making things online is a really good first-hand experience of seeing how stories can sort of reach someone and touch someone so instantly. There's little delay. I feel like online stuff is the equivalent of sitting around a fire and sort of sharing a story like that, but instead of sort of someone's face through the fire, it's a comment about someone talking about their family.
Thank you. And yeah.
Questions?
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Some really interesting points you made there. Eloise, I suppose the question from me is your journey from, I didn't know what you were doing at Pinewood before, but how did you transcend to what you're doing now? And what were some of the lessons that you learned earlier in your career that you now looks back on and sort of thinks, fuck, I wish I'd known this, and I wish I'd known that.
Oh, dude, I could do a whole panel on that. So when I was at Pinewood, I literally started as a runner. That was the first thing that I did. I was ironing tablecloths on Great British Bake Off, I didn't iron again for a long time after that because it was painful. And then wrap presents on this film called The Nutcracker and the Four Realms. And again, I'm known now not to wrap presents for people because it was just too many presents were wrapped. I literally started right at the bottom, and then this is my previous life, but I trained as a chef in a previous life. So I then went and became a film food stylist, and I worked on Murder on the Orient Express, and Daisy Ridley was on that film, and coincidentally, like, I don't know, 9 years later, I just directed her in a VR experience that we're now turning into a film. So it's like a weird full circle. So I think, I don't know, in terms of the lessons, I would just say nothing is a waste of time. Like, I genuinely believe that nothing's a waste of time. Even if you pitch something and it doesn't become anything, it's not a waste of time because you're still flexing creative muscles. I've learned to really love the process of developing and pitching, even if it doesn't come to something. I developed a sizzle at the end of last year for a documentary, and I don't know if it will happen or not, but developing that sizzle was one of the best things that I did last year. It was just so fun. So I think, like, enjoy the creative process, no matter if it has gains that are apparent or not. And then I think I've got like a phrase where I just say, what if it all works out, which like combats any form of anxiety. So I would have that in the back of your mind anytime when things go wrong. Yeah, there are loads. I think, like, build your team as well. Really think about who your team are and build your team. I'm very lucky to have met Dave. And like he's being very humble about it, but Dave was the head of PlayStation Studios at London, and then started his company at the same time that I started developing Pirate Queen, and we just like synced up and took it from there. And like, Pirate Queen wouldn't have happened without Dave. So I think build your team, and like, you don't know everything, and that's okay, and it's okay to ask for help, and people love giving advice. So just go out and be really honest and be like, this is what I want to do, and just identify your weaknesses and find people who have those as strengths.
Can I just make a couple of observations? Thank you, by the way. About Eloise, which is one, her resilience is amazing. So even though every now and again there's a little heart-to-heart about, it's all gone wrong and blah, 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 like the next day she's off like to the races again, which is amazing. And also the other thing is she however high I think we can shoot, she'll always shoot higher. Yeah. And I think it's absolutely, we literally just over lunch was like, we should do this thing like this. Why don't we do it like this? Actually, you're right, we could probably do that. So, you know, don't be put off, don't be limited by who you are. Yeah. Eloise is not limited. I don't mean that you should be, but she always shoots high. It's like, really, you got Lucy Lou, how'd you do that? You know, that sort of thing. I think that's good advice.
Thank you. Any other questions out there?
Yeah, just a quick question. What are your ultimate goals?
Yeah, that's an easy question. I'll start off that one. Ultimate goals. I think just keep making stuff that makes me feel like I'm understanding my life and expressing things. I think in the back of my mind there's also the idea of like, well, so I hope I can get another freelance job, and like hopefully maybe that leads to something. And I often, like, my focus definitely shifts more to like, oh yeah, I want to be making like stuff for other people and like get into TV and stuff. So my focus does often drift there, but whenever it reaches a completely different path, I always come back to my personal projects and just find comfort in, as long as I can keep, you know, earning enough money doing the odd freelance gig here and there that can fund my own personal things. I think, you know, in the long run, I think ultimately that will probably be fulfillment, but also directing a Star Wars film.
Probably ought to wind up there.
Okay, all right. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Myles and Dave and Eloise.